Okay, so a quick reminder that all our recordings and presentations will be available to registered attendees via our resource hub after the event. A link to the resource hub will be appearing on your screen right about now, so please click there if you want to have access to more of the information. Next up today, we have Sarah Wahltinez, an aquatic animal veterinarian and aquaculture consultant. So we're going from dairy to fish. Sarah's presentation will get us thinking about the sentience actually of aquatic invertebrates and the ethical dimensions on managing and farming these species. So really interesting talk coming your way. Over to Sarah.
Good afternoon, I'm Sarah Wahltinez, and today we're going to talk about ethics of aquatic invertebrate farming and management. Today's presentation is going to cover just some basics about what animal welfare is. This is probably going to be a review for a lot of you, but I think it's really important to make sure that we're all on the same page and using terms in the same way. We'll briefly talk about welfare assessments and some of the relevant things that we think about with aquatic invertebrates. We'll talk about some of the challenges in aquatic invertebrate welfare, how we safeguard invertebrate welfare, and then a few case studies just to kind of get you thinking about some of the things that we've talked about. So starting off with, what is animal welfare? The way that we define animal welfare at Nautilus Collaboration, where I work, is that animal welfare encompasses an animal's physical well-being and experiences, using a 5 domains approach in animals' nutrition, physical environment, health, and behavioral interactions impact its experiences, and that feeds into positive, neutral, or negative animal welfare. Some other things to think about when we're talking about animal welfare is that it's the state of the animal, how that animal is doing in the conditions in which it lives. And I really love this diagram, the welfare worm here, which demonstrates that animals aren't always in good welfare. They're not always experiencing poor welfare. Sometimes it's swinging back and forth with day-to-day activities. And what we're aiming for is to stay in the purple, in the positive experiences and the positive welfare, more than we are below that line in the negative. I do want to say that animal welfare is science-based, and it varies on a continuum from very poor to excellent. And importantly, when we're talking about farming, it ends at death. While animal welfare is a science, our ethics and how we think about things and the way that we believe that we should interact with animals do impact how we make those judgments about what an animal wants or needs and how much weight we put into different areas of animal welfare. And I think it's really important that we think about, where am I coming from? And so I come from a utilitarian background. I work in aquaculture, I work in animal farming. And so I believe that, yes, we can use animals, we can consume animals, but then it's our responsibility and our duty to do the best that we can by those animals. One of the important frameworks for animal welfare are the 5 freedoms. And these were founded, or I guess written, in 1965. They're the freedom from hunger and malnutrition, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. And these 5 freedoms were written when agriculture was becoming intensified following World War II. There was some concerns about the way animals were treated, and there was a landmark book written called Animal Machines, which really highlighted some of the, quite frankly, terrible ways that we were treating animals as we were intensifying agriculture. So that background kind of helps us understand why they're written the way they are. Freedom from, so trying to keep away the bad things from animals rather than really promoting on the positive. But our understanding of animal welfare has evolved since the 1960s. And so one of the more recent frameworks are the 5 domains, which you'll notice they're very similar to the 5 freedoms, but they're placed in a way that we really acknowledge the contribution of mental and affective state on animal welfare. So domain 1 is nutrition, domain 2, the physical environment. In aquaculture, by and large, that's our water quality and the environment in the pond or the rearing system we have that animal in. Domain 3, health. As a veterinarian, that's a really big one that I emphasize, and that's always on top of mind. And then domain 4, behavioral interaction. And that's an animal's interaction with the other animals in its pond, with maybe a predator that's coming into the pond and trying to take animals. And that's interactions also with people. So if we're catching a fish to do a health assessment, as well as them interacting with that environment. And so those 4 domains feed into the mental and affective state of an animal, and altogether that contributes to the welfare status. Now, a common question I always get, but how do I know what an invertebrate is thinking or feeling? How do I even know about this mental or affective state? There are a few things that we can do to try to get an indication of what an animal is experiencing. So there are physiologic measures. We're really working on developing these in invertebrates, but some of the ones we have right now are heart rate and heart rate variability, meaning if the heart is going from fast to slower and fast to slower, that kind of variability can give us an idea of any kind of stress that that animal might be experiencing and how its nervous system is functioning. And we also do have some stress hormone levels. A famous one is crustacean hyperglycemic hormone, which is elevated in crustaceans experiencing stress. We also, if we're talking about mental and affective state, we need to be thinking about cognitive assessment. So what's going on? What is that experience? What's going on in that brain, that central nervous system? Some of the things that we can use are approach to novel objects. So if we put something in a pond or where an animal is, are they going to go up to that novel object? We can talk about cognitive bias, some spatial navigation tests. So how does that animal move around the environment? And we can do things like operant conditioning or memory, but by and large, we don't really use those in aquaculture. We don't really use a lot of the cognitive assessments, but that is an area of research and something that we are actively working on improving. But at the end of the day, we can really focus on doing our best in domains 1 to 4 and keep making strides towards understanding the subjective experiences of invertebrates, that emotional, that mental or affective state. So just because we don't fully understand what their experience is, it doesn't mean we just throw everything out. We really just focus on doing our best in those domains 1 to 4. We keep up with the latest research. We try to do different projects and understand as best we can, and keep moving that needle forward. I can't talk about invertebrate welfare without talking about speciesism, which is when different levels of consideration are given to an animal's welfare as a consequence of their species rather than any evidence. And so a question we can ask ourselves is, would this be acceptable in another species? And if not, is that because there's a physiologic basis? Is there an evidence basis that indicates that that's okay in this species or not okay in this species? But it's just really important to remember that we do have biases, and that we want to be treating invertebrates to the best of our ability. Another thing I can't do a talk on invertebrates without mentioning is sentience. And sentience is an oversimplification, but it's the capacity to have feelings. So feelings like pain, pleasure, hunger, thirst, warmth, joy, comfort, excitement. These are subjective, which means we can't directly measure them. And sentience is related to pain because sentience is a prerequisite for pain. Pain is defined as an aversive sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in such damage. And that's the definition by the IASP, the International Association for the Study of Pain. And so that's a human definition. And the really important part of this definition is that emotional experience. And so that's how sentience and pain are related. If we don't have the capacity to have feelings, to have emotions, we then wouldn't be able to have the capacity to feel pain. I do want to point out there is a difference between pain and nociception. So pain is the product of higher order brain center processing. Again, that emotional experience, it's going up in your cortex, you're processing it, you're having a much larger experience than just, oh, that's hot, or just detecting something that's noxious. So nociception is the ability to detect noxious stimuli. So that's a nerve transmission, and it's going to go up into the thalamus, so it can go up into the brain, but you're not really having that higher order processing. You're not ending up with that emotional experience. So at the end of the day, sentience and pain in aquatic animals are both subjective private experiences, and there is quite a rigorous debate if fish and aquatic invertebrates are sentient and have that pain sensation capacity. To date, we have the most evidence for fish, cephalopod mollusks, and crustaceans. But again, definitively proven sentience or pain perception is not a prerequisite for animal welfare considerations. Just because we don't have all of that evidence doesn't mean that we can just ignore animal welfare for fish and aquatic invertebrates. Okay, now switching gears and talking about how we assess welfare. So there's kind of three broad categories we use to assess animal welfare. We have our animal-based indicators. We can think of those as our outputs. We have resource-based indicators. We can think of those as our inputs. And then another category of an input is an operational indicator. So some animal-based indicators that we use in aquaculture, we kind of broadly think of them in individual and population level. Now, animal welfare is an experience by an individual, but the way that we farm aquatic animals, the way that we farm aquatic invertebrates and fish, there's a lot of individuals in a pond. And so sometimes we need to be using population indicators to get an idea about the experience and what's going on in that entire pond. We don't want to exclusively use population-based indicators, but they can be a helpful tool in those types of systems. On an individual level, some of the things we're going to be doing are looking for things like lesions, assessing behavior. You might be standing on the edge of a pond and watching the prawns inside that pond. From a population level, some of those animal-based indicators would be the amount of feed consumed. So, we've put 5 kilos in, how much of that was actually consumed by the animals. And then in aquaculture, we do something called a feed conversion ratio, or an FCR, which in essence is how many kilos of food went in and how many kilos of meat of product came out of that pond. Some of our resource-based indicators are the amount of food offered. So you can see there's a difference. So the animal-based is the food that was actually consumed versus the resources, how much food are we offering. Another resource-based indicator is the nutritional composition of feed, and there's a lot of work being done right now in aquaculture about this. Of course, water quality, that's a huge one. Things like vaccines and appropriate handling. And then those operational indicators are things like our SOPs, our standard operating procedures for feeding or our crowding and handling, the design of our filtration systems. And yes, in invertebrates, we often call them fish health plans. No, invertebrates aren't fish, but that's tends to be what they're called. And we also have things like vaccination certificates or records demonstrating that the animals actually got those resources. And sometimes you might see an operational indicator called a management indicator. It just depends. They're the same thing, just depends on how you're phrasing it. At the end of the day, there is no single perfect indicator of welfare. We do try to focus on animal-based things, or at least make sure that they're included, because remember, animal welfare is that experience of the animal. So we want to know, how is that animal doing? I can provide perfect water quality. I can provide, the most nutritionally balanced, amazing feed, but that doesn't mean that animal is guaranteed to be experiencing positive animal welfare. I can't grant animal welfare. And so I need to be using a combination of indicators to really get a better idea of what's happening for that animal and that animal's experiences. Now, another question I get all the time, but how do we know what animals want or need, or what things do we need to put in as factors? And so there's a few different ways that we can do this. We can do things like longitudinal evaluation of different factors. So how well do animals do under different conditions? And we evaluate that over a very long period of time, maybe multiple production cycles. Another thing we can use is, what do they do in their natural environment? So what behaviors do they exhibit? What kind of social groupings are they in? Where are they at in their water column? What are they interacting with? Do they interact with the substrate on the bottom? Do they stay up in the water column? And in some cases, we might be using wild conspecifics, so the same type of animal, but the free-ranging individuals. There's some caveats to that, especially in aquaculture as we start to be domesticating stocks. Maybe that comparison isn't the most valid, or that comparison isn't the best. But we can use it to kind of get a foothold, especially if it's a newer species in aquaculture, or we're less familiar, or we're asking a question. That's one of the pieces of evidence we can use. Within that, some of the things we can think about are time budget analysis. So how much time do they spend foraging or looking for food? How much time do they spend doing maintenance behaviors, cleaning those long, beautiful antennae? And we also can use an ethogram. So looking at all of the behaviors of the individuals that they perform, we can get an idea of kind of the behavioral integrity in our different systems. Are they able to express those behaviors? Of course, I'm most interested in behaviors that an animal is motivated to perform. So we might not need every single behavior that's performed by a wild conspecific, but we need to try to get information about what is important to that animal. And the two kind of broad categories we can use for that are preference testing. So you give them a variety of substrates. There's a picture of a zebrafish preference test on the right, looking at different substrates and kind of tank furniture to see where they're going to spend more of their time. Caveat here is that preference testing only tells us of the options we provided to that animal. So it doesn't say, oh, absolutely, the gravel is the perfect substrate for fish. It just means fish preferred the side with the gravel rather than sand. We can also use motivation testing, and we can kind of think of this as, how much is an animal willing to pay to get access to that resource? So famous examples are with chickens with a weighted door. How much weight are they willing to push on that door to access things like a dust bath or a perch or a different kind of feed? The motivation testing hasn't been done as often in aquatic animals, but it is something that I think is interesting. So now let's talk about some challenges in aquatic invertebrate welfare. So broadly speaking, good animal welfare in aquaculture requires good genetics, disease prevention, an appropriate housing system, management that takes into account the needs of the species, the ability to express behaviors that are important to the animal, like we just talked about, humane handling, minimizing distress, so bad stress, especially during things like transport, humane slaughter, and then choice and control in their environment. So some of our challenges in aquatic invertebrate welfare is we know a lot less about aquatic invertebrates than we do terrestrial mammals, and they have a very, very different experience than ours. We don't live in an aquatic environment where sound is conducted in a different way, where light is very different. And we have to be very careful that we're not assessing or thinking about invertebrate welfare as if I were a prawn. If I were a prawn, I'd want crystal clear water. That might not actually be true to the prawn. The light coming through there might be aversive to them. And so we just need to be very careful that our own experiences don't color this too much. There's lots of opportunities for research, and one issue with aquatic invertebrates is it can be hard to observe them. And this is a prawn farm here with all of the ponds, and the water can be quite murky or not as clear. So we might not be able to see a lot of the individuals in that pond. So other challenges are complex life cycles. This isn't an animal that's like a mini version of the adult when it is born or in its life cycle. I do want to point out that this doesn't happen all in the same pond. We don't complete the whole life cycle in one production unit. We have domesticated stocks, and we have different systems for different life cycles. But we do have to think about, does a juvenile prawn have the same experience and welfare considerations as some of these guys over here, like the Nautilus, which are very different in the way that they interact with the environment? We also think about diversity of species. So we have roughly 40 species of decapod crustaceans farmed worldwide. They have different sizes and anatomy, different environmental needs, and what's good for one species is not necessarily good welfare for another. In this slide, you can see here, this is a giant freshwater prawn, so they live in freshwater that doesn't have any salt, versus Penaeus monodon, which live by and large in brackish water. And this is a type of prawn that we farm here in Australia. Another challenge is the aquatic environment is complex and factors are often interrelated. So ammonia concentrations, that's our waste product of metabolism, that concentration and toxicity is going to increase as the pH increases. So as the acidity decreases in a pond, or the alkalinity or the baseness of the pond increases. We also have to keep in mind that a pond is an entire ecosystem. And so we've got zooplankton, little animals, and phytoplankton, little plants floating in the water column that act as food sources. And we can do things like fertilize ponds or add other compounds to manipulate those species and the different compositions, but we do not have complete control over that ecosystem. We simply cannot feasibly control every parameter in a pond. Of course, water quality is very important, and it's not just that number, but also the variability. Each species has different tolerances with what they prefer and what they can survive in. But I do want to point out that survival does not equal good welfare. Just because animals are growing or are surviving doesn't mean that they're necessarily experiencing good welfare. Some of the things we think about are dissolved oxygen, the pH, alkalinity, and hardness, temperature, those nitrogenous wastes, ammonia, which is broken down by bacteria into nitrite, which is again toxic, and then is again broken down into nitrate, which is less toxic to aquatic animals, as well as things like turbidity and suspended solids, what's in that water column, the salinity, and then our water flow. Another challenge is the massive number of individual animals being farmed. So in 2022, according to the FAO, there was 5,160,047 tons of crustaceans and 203,898 tons of mollusks farmed. And I know it's hard to think about in terms of kind of like tons. So when we think about the number of individuals, this research is from 2017 numbers, but estimated somewhere between 5 to 15 billion individual crabs, 37 to 60 billion individual crayfish and lobsters, and 213 to 530 billion shrimps and prawns. So that's a lot of animals that we need to be considering and thinking about their welfare and how they're doing. And then a hard reality about animal welfare is animal welfare considerations are often proportional to the value of the individual animal. And so our animal welfare considerations for less expensive species like prawns are often less than that of high value species, something like a lobster. Again, that's that speciesism. We don't necessarily have a evidence-based reason for that. It's just simply, due to that animal's worth. But I know that's heavy, that's a lot. But I do want to really emphasize that many farmers care about their animals, and there's lots of people doing a great job in this space. Yes, we need a lot of work, but there also are lots of changes and improvements being made in aquaculture. Let's talk about some of the things that we do to help safeguard invertebrate welfare. So again, we need to be thinking about research to understand the needs of each species, things like feeds, our water quality, the structure of the environment, stocking density. And these are a few papers that have come out in the past few years about those areas. We need to be setting up plans and protocols, things like our biosecurity plans to prevent disease, our fish health plans, our water quality monitoring and maintenance, feeding and feed management, and handling, making sure that stock people are appropriately trained. And of course, humane handling techniques. So things like anesthesia, analgesia, and again, staff training. And so this is me on an abalone farm. Those abalone have been anesthetized, and that allows you to easily scoop them up so you're not stressing them out. You're not having to pry them off of their substrate, and we can move them to a different production unit to grow them. So we also, when we're thinking about analgesia for invertebrates, we need to be thinking in terms of basics, things like our local anesthetics, conserving sodium channels, lidocaine, benzocaine, those types of local anesthetics. And we do have evidence that they have an impact on invertebrates. We have to be careful about using different kinds of pain medicine like morphine, which might be causing sedation rather than really having that pain control. And that impacts how we are able to assess them. So moving on very briefly onto our case study with the crown of thorns, and I know we're running out of time. So crown of thorns are corallivorous sea stars, meaning they eat coral, and they can consume up to 10 square meters of coral per year. But they prefer faster growing corals. So that's their role in the ecosystem. They're supposed to be here. They're native to the Indo-Pacific, to the Great Barrier Reef. And so what they do is they eat the faster growing corals to make sure that some of the slower growing corals actually have a chance on those reefs. We have been seeing outbreaks, and when they say the word outbreak, they mean an explosion in population numbers since 1962. And we think that's due to things like increased larval survival and the removal of predators, both of which were influenced by people. So to decrease their numbers, we inject them with bile salts or vinegar. We are developing traps with pheromones. You can see this headline here: sea star murdering robots are deployed in the Great Barrier Reef, and they were injecting the crown of thorns, I think, with bile acids. And here you can see a diver has a spear, and they have one of those compounds to inject the sea stars. And so we have to ask ourselves, is this a humane death? Do sea stars have the capacity to suffer? Are they having a negative experience? Does it matter that they're technically native to these ecosystems, that they're supposed to be here? Does it matter that they're damaging a struggling ecosystem, that the corals are already struggling and so they're adding on top of it? And I don't have the answers for you. These are just things I want you to be thinking about, and thinking about the way that we treat invertebrates. Is this acceptable? And again, depending on your ethics, in different places it might be, and for different people, they might have an opposing view. Briefly, moving on to humane slaughter, I do want to point out the terminology we use surrounding the end of an animal's life. So these terms mean different things and need to be used in the appropriate context. Euthanasia we use when we're using a method that minimizes pain and distress, and at its core, euthanasia is performed for the animal's good. So that animal that has a disease or a painful condition that can't be treated. Humane killing is not performed to end an animal's suffering. So that might be something in a laboratory where we need to be collecting samples. And then slaughter is killing an animal for consumption by humans or another animal. When we think about humane, what does that mean? That's marked by compassion, sympathy, or consideration for humans or other animals. And humane slaughter is marked by a rapid loss of sensibility. So that means that an animal rapidly loses the ability to receive sensations, often by seeing something like a loss of brain function. And we're also minimizing anxiety, pain, and distress through that process. There's often two steps to a humane slaughter protocol. Number one, stunning. So this is what's going to cause the loss of brain function, but not necessarily kill an animal. So something like electric shock, percussive stunning, or hypothermia in aquaculture. And that's followed by a second step, a killing step that results in death. In fish, this is by and large cutting the gill arches. And then in invertebrates, this is often an ice slurry. So how do we currently slaughter invertebrates? We currently use an ice slurry or very cold water, potentially something like a rapid freezing in nitrogen, liquid nitrogen, or a brine freezer, dewatering, which is removing animals from water, or sometimes fresh water, which we call drowning. So taking a saltwater animal and putting them in fresh water. Definitely for any of you listening at home who might partake in seafood at home that maybe you need to kill, you get it alive, please don't place them in hot or boiling water until nerve centers are destroyed. In the areas of aquaculture, there's a lot of research being done right now on electrical stunners. So the pictures on the left of the slide are something called a crustastun. And so that is kind of a restaurant level application versus those two big electric stunners on the slide could be done at a farm. So the left side is a dry stunner made by Optimar, the right side an in-water stunner made by ACE. We're also doing a lot of work in things like hypothermic shock. So are there ways to make an ice slurry that is more humane and results in a much more rapid death? The challenges here are we need to account for food safety. We're creating a product for people to eat, and we need to make sure that it is safe for them to eat it. We also need to maintain and improve that product quality where possible, even if it's the most humane method of killing, of slaughtering an invertebrate. If you can't eat the product at the end, then we've just raised an animal for nothing, and that's not honoring its experience either. And then two really big questions. How do we tell when they're insensible? And how do we tell when they're dead? Seem like trivial questions, but they're actually really hard. And some talented people have been working on things like doing an EEG, an electroencephalogram, on crayfish. Some invertebrates have a diffuse nervous system. They don't really have that main central nervous system to take those measurements, which makes this challenging, but not impossible. So just briefly wrapping up, we've talked about these things, and our summary is that animal welfare encompasses an animal's physical well-being and their experiences, and it's a really important part of responsible farming. Animal welfare indicators can be direct, indirect, or management or operational indicators. And there are many challenges in aquatic invertebrate welfare, including our lack of knowledge, how complex the aquatic environment is, their complex life cycles, and the sheer number of individuals. Aquatic animal welfare is challenging, but there's lots of really great people doing good work. I also want to say words matter, and it's important we use the correct terms. So where can we do better? I want you to think outside the box. This is my call to action for you. Creative approaches are required, and we need to be challenging the status quo. Just because something's always been done that way doesn't mean that's the best. We need more research on what's important to aquacultured species, and that research needs to be done on diverse taxa. We farm 40 species of crustaceans. Important that we do research on all 40. And of course, we need further information on humane culling and slaughter techniques. But at the end of the day, small practical changes can have a huge impact on aquatic invertebrate welfare. So that is my contact information, and I think now we are going to have some time for questions. Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Well, joining us live now is Dr. Sarah Wahltinez. Hello and welcome, Sarah. Just get you to unmute. There we go. We can't see you either, which, oh, there you are. You've popped up.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, a few little technical details. Thank you for that, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much. The statistics that you presented on just how many aquatic invertebrate animals are being farmed across the world are really staggering. And I think it really emphasizes the importance for us to get their management right and to start thinking about their welfare. So I think it's definitely triggered quite a few questions from our audience. So that's fantastic. I'll start with a question from Uttara, which is, what do we understand about sentience so far? And is there general consensus that mollusks like oysters and mussels do not show enough evidence of sentience? On a sustainable note, is there evidence to show that consuming them is more environmentally sustainable than other types of seafood?
This is a great question, so thank you for asking, Atara. When we say mollusks, this is a really tough thing because cephalopod mollusks, so like our octopus, our squid, our nautilus, our cuttlefish, those are also mollusks. So a lot of the research has been done on the cephalopods, or in Australia we say cephalopods, but we haven't done quite as much with the bivalves, which are those mussels and scallops, oysters. We know that their nervous system is set up a little different. They exhibit less complexity. I don't think that means that they don't have sentience or they don't have subjective experiences, but it does make it more challenging to study it using tools that were developed for mammals and other vertebrates. So right now, I'd say that we're data deficient on the bivalves. I just saw that there's some new exciting research coming out on gastropods. So these are our snails and our slugs. And so I think there's more to be learned for sure there. And as for, is it more environmentally sustainable to eat them? Sustainable means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so it's hard to say exactly what metrics we want to use. I will say they're great filter feeders, which means they're removing things out of the environment like algae. They're actually cleaning the water. So I do think that they are environmentally friendly in that way.
Great, thank you very much for that. I'm going to combine a couple of questions together. I've got and I. So this is around a greater number of smaller animals are often required to produce the equivalent meat yield for a single larger animal. Does raising smaller animals for meat offer any inherent animal welfare advantages?
Another great question, a hard one. I will say that I don't know that animal size is what would offer any animal welfare advantages. It's more, can we provide an environment for those animals that is appropriate? Can we allow them to do behaviors that they are motivated to do and that they're experiencing or have the capacity to feel positive emotions and positive welfare? So, size is a tricky one. I would maybe argue the opposite, that if we're farming a lot of smaller individuals, there's potential for more animal welfare concerns, because animal welfare is assessed and experienced on that individual level.
Interesting, and definitely a challenge for the aquaculture industry, I think. Um, Richard has asked, given the potential for aquaculture to provide a large proportion of the world's protein requirements, and we're talking about human protein requirements in the future, how will improving aquatic animal welfare look going forward, especially in non-Western countries?
Yes, another great question, Richard. And this is really exciting about the aquaculture industry. This is one of our only agricultural industries that can expand at the rate that we need to meet that demand for animal-based protein. In terms of what that welfare looks like, again, there's still a lot of research to be done. And especially if we're thinking about things like fish, the majority of our fish welfare to date has been performed on salmon. And so in my presentation, I talked about how sometimes the worth of a species dictates how much research and considerations go into their welfare. So the financial incentive behind that species. And so salmon, of course, are a high value species, but they're only 6.9% of the biomass of fish that we produce, versus the top 5 species are things like tilapia, carp, and catfish, which don't have the same market value. And so as we think about non-Western countries aquaculture expanding, it's typically in those species. And so we do need more research to understand what those animals need and what they find aversive and what they're motivated to do, as well as humane killing methods. We've discovered that some of these methods we have for salmon, like the electrical stunners, don't quite work the same way in other species. And I'm involved in a few research projects right now trying to untangle why that might be happening. So we definitely need a lot more information, particularly in those diverse taxa that we are seeing increase. In terms of fish, we farm over 300 species of fish. And I mentioned the presentation, more than 40 species of crustaceans. So definitely we need to understand those differences in each species' needs and wants, to be able to provide appropriate welfare.
Yeah, thank you very much. Interesting indeed. Another question from Richard, which is around recreationally caught crustaceans, crabs, and eastern rock lobsters. This is a very practical question. Is placing them in the freezer prior to cooking considered humane?
Great question, Richard. No, we don't want to be putting them into the freezer. We know that when animals get ice crystals forming in their nervous system, that it can be quite painful. And actually, RSPCA has a fantastic handout, and maybe I'll see if we could add that to the resources or link that in the chat somehow. And it demonstrates where to cut depending on what the species is. And so in crabs, we're going to do something called splitting. So you're going to go down the center of the crab with a sharp implement like a knife. And then for lobsters, you go more for the head end for the nervous system centers there. So there's a great handout from RSPCA. I do want to say freezing, I guess I should have said a blanket no. Freezing for cold water species is definitely less humane because they are more adapted to the cold environment. Chilling, decreasing the body temperature for a warm water adapted crustacean is considered more humane.
Yeah, thank you. And you're right, this species to species difference, it makes it quite complicated, doesn't it? There's no one size fits all, so it's very interesting. I think we've got time for one more question. Could you comment on the trade-off between welfare and environmental impacts of farmed versus fresh caught seafood? That's from Uttara.
Uta, another great question. So in terms of animal welfare, I do think in aquaculture, we are able to provide a little bit more input on those animals, and we're also able to have better systems in place when it comes time to slaughter those animals, versus the welfare of fish and fisheries is has not been as researched. There are some new developments in Europe, in Northern Europe. They're putting some electrical stunners on commercial fishery vessels that go out and collect wild fish. So exciting things happening in that space. And so, of course, again, there's no blanket answer that truly answers that. However, we do know we've been putting a lot of pressure on those wild fish stocks. And so we do know that a lot of them, it depends on region to region, and there's a lot of information from the FAO about which stocks of fish are considered sustainable. Off the coast of Western Australia, there's a really sustainable rock lobster fishery. In fact, they were among the first fisheries in the world to be certified as being sustainable. So again, I'm sorry, I know it's not satisfying, but it's going to be case by case. And of course, aquaculture is not a perfect industry, and there are things that we're doing to improve on that front as well.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to time. So apologies again to our audience that we haven't got through all the questions. I am so thrilled that we had such amazing engagement on your topic, Sarah, because often it's harder to get people engaged in something that's not cute and fluffy. But yeah, it's been fantastic, and really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so for our audience, we have a short break now until 2:30, so you have about 14 minutes. Our next speaker after the break is Dr. Simon Coughlin, and we'll be starting that at 2:30 Canberra time. So please make sure you rejoin by then, and we'll see you shortly.